We're in the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins or nieces, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn.
On April 9th, 1942, the United States suffered great defeat on the peninsula of Bataan in the Philippines. After losing to the Imperial Japanese forces in the Battle for Bataan, 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers were forced on a dangerous 75-mile march from Bataan to Capiz. This event, which took the lives of 21,000 men, is remembered in infamy as the Bataan Death March. One brave soul who endured the march was a 31-year-old chaplain from southern Indiana. His name was Thomas J. Cecina. Let's take a closer look at his service to his comrades, his country, and his faith. Thomas Cecina was born on September 16, 1910, in Vicksburg, Indiana. He was the son of Slavic immigrants. He and his brother were both ordained priests of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis by June of 1935. After residing at St. John's Parish in Indianapolis, he enlisted in the U.S. Chaplains Reserve Corps. In October of 1939, he was assigned to the 57th Infantry, a group of elite soldiers on Luzon in the Philippines. There, he gave daily mass to his fellow soldiers and to the local Filipinos.
Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor, America's mid-Pacific naval bastion.
December 7th, 1941. The Japanese Air Force infamously bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, launching the United States into World War II. On that same day, Japan also planned to invade mainland China and the Philippines, an ally to the U.S. The American forces in the Philippines fought to stop the invading forces from reaching the mainland in the Battle of Bataan. By the time the battle was in its second month, the Americans were running out of food, medicine, ammunition, and soldiers. General MacArthur had retreated to the island of Corregidor, leaving his men alone on the Bataan Peninsula. He ensured his men that reinforcements were on their way from the States. Those reinforcements never came.
April 1st, 1942, the 115th day of war. Yes, it's April Fool's Day for the men of Bataan. The only army in the world boxed up and bottled up. We certainly are the biggest fools of this war, fighting for the biggest and strongest nation in the world. The War Department keeps telling us to fight to the last man, fight to the last hole. For help, men, guns, material are on the way. We have deserted us, and we are on our own. Every day is April Fool's Day. Albert N. Brown.
Father Tom, amidst all this, did all he could to keep morale up among his friends. In April of 1942, 3 months after the invasion of the Philippines, the army and their allies had no choice but to surrender to the Japanese. Japan now had control over the Bataan Peninsula and the mainland Philippines. All the remaining troops in the islands were gathered up. The Japanese, being a prisoner of war, was the greatest disgrace imaginable. Japanese soldiers were still trained under the ancient samurai code of Bushido, where it is the most honorable to die on the battlefield than to live a prisoner. The American prisoners of war were treated as lower than animals, subject to torture, beheadings, and the most inhumane acts imaginable. On April 9th, the Japanese military unleashed their plan of ultimate brutality on their prisoners. They started transporting all 75,000 prisoners of war to Camp O'Donnell, 65 miles north of Bataan. The only way that all soldiers could be moved was on foot until they reached the train stations in San Fernando. Thus began the roughly 5-day-long trek known as the Bataan Death March. Father Tom, who was given the option to leave for Corregidor, chose to march with his friends. On the march, soldiers were forced to endure the climate of the area, which had boiling hot days and became freezing cold at night. Dirt and dust blew in their faces with each step. Many died from heat and exhaustion. Diseases like dysentery and other such infections were running rampant.
Malaria, diarrhea, dysentery were rampant. There was no medical care. Amoebic dysentery was a death sentence.
Most of the men went the whole time with no food or water. Those who ran to wells on the side of the road to take a drink were gunned down by Japanese officers. Marchers that couldn't keep up or would fall behind were beaten, stabbed, and often killed. Some officers rode on horseback using katanas to behead slower marchers. Any bodies that weren't placed on the side of the road or carried all the way were trampled over by the marchers, tanks, and trucks. After the grueling weeks of marching, they were loaded like cattle into boxcars and taken the rest of the way to Camp O'Donnell. Once there, they worked like slaves on the camps or in the fields. They were given very little food, medicine, or clothing.
We were barefooted, usually wearing a G-string, which was a panel of cloth attached to a piece of tape. The tape was tied around your waist, and the long panel of cloth was pulled up through the crotch and attached to the tape in front. We usually carried a water bottle attached to a piece of string or cloth, and wore a straw hat if you had one.
Captives were still dying at rates of hundreds by the day. At Camp O'Donnell, Father Tom stayed, preaching to his fellow prisoners, praying for them, and celebrating their sacraments.
At night, someone would call out, "Chaplain, give us a prayer." A voice would come out of the darkness, uttering the most fervent, meaningful prayers I have ever heard.
In the autumn of 1942, Japan began to evacuate Camp O'Donnell and move the prisoners. They loaded onto unmarked carrier boats with no lifeboats or safety measures in place. These vessels are referred to as hell ships by those who lived to tell the tale.
The Japanese loaded 1,600 of us aboard the Orioko Maru, a large Japanese liner. We were crammed into 3 holes, sitting in bays much like shells, each man sitting between the legs of the man behind him. Thus began a 47-day nightmare of horrendous inhumanity and barbarism. The lack of air and water, the confined space, the constriction of movement produced near panic.
Once again, Father Tom was given the option to stay at Camp O'Donnell, but refused, knowing where he was needed most. He boarded the Arisan Maru on the morning of October 24th. Since the vessel was unmarked as a POW ship, the American submarine USS Shark fired a torpedo at the ship. Over the next few hours, the ship slowly descended into the abyss. Father Tom knew that this was the end of the line for him and his comrades. He, along with Father James O'Brien, the other chaplain aboard the Arisan Maru, heard confessions and gave the last rites to as many men as they could. Father Tom gave general absolution of all sins aboard the ship. At 7 p.m., the Arisan Maru met its terrible fate, taking the lives of over 1,700 men. Only 9 survived this tragedy. Father Tom went down with the ship, finally finding rest from the hell he endured over the past 3 years. He was 34 years old at the time.
Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it."
The legacy of the Bataan March is definitely never forgotten. Every year in White Sands, New Mexico, thousands of civilians and military personnel alike gather to participate in the Bataan Memorial Death March, a marathon-length hike in memory of those who endured the march 73 years ago. Many of the last living survivors and their families gather to share their experiences and make sure that their stories live on long after they are gone.
Oscar, Leonard.
I am Gerald Schertz. I'm Oscar L. Leonard.
My name is Linda Anderson.
My name is William Overmeyer.
I'm a descendant of one of the POWs from the Bataan Death March. He was a prisoner in Mukden, which is a camp in Manchuria, China.
I landed in the Philippines in 1940, and our regimental commander volunteered our services to go overseas. The Catholic priests were really highlighted in almost every book that's written by some survivor, because they lived their faith, they practiced their faith to the way it's supposed to be.
I work for the Department of Defense in the Recreation Division, and we've been hosting this event for 26 years. New Mexico State University had initially run the event and became too big for them, so we inherited it, and it's an awesome event. I mean, we do it in honor of the survivors of the Bataan Memorial Death March. So.
They must trek through the blaring New Mexico heat, sand, and mountains. One of the marchers was Cecina's own Mr. Hegarty.
Really enjoying myself. It's long, it's hot, but it's very inspiring to see the veterans, warriors with no legs or one leg, and I realized then what bad shape I'm in.
He gave his life just as truly for the cause of human freedom, the principles of democracy, and above all, the true spirit of Christianity. He carried the cross to his grave. Captain O. Edward Solomon.
Father Tom, in his time in the Chaplain's Corps, went through hell and back, but never once did he resolve break. He spread the word of God till the very end.